Welcome back to another edition of the Quantum Yoga Podcast. We're here with Dr. Josh Lamaro. I hope I didn't mispronounce your name.
You got it correct. That's
okay,
it.
Good. All right. Who's a osteopathic doctor in Melbourne, Australia. Thanks, Josh, for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me.
I wonder if we can take a minute here and you just introduce your work and what you do in Melbourne to the listeners.
Okay. Well, yeah, as you said, I'm trained as an osteopath, and Australian trained osteopaths still kind of subscribing to the original osteopathic model, at least when I was still studying, which was not largely kind of focused towards the way in which osteopathy has gone in Australia now, which seems to be more geared towards musculoskeletal complaints. But during the training, the history of the inception of osteopathy was still quite prominent in our training, in that, you know, the body's this integrated unit with no part that's separate from any other part. And inherent in the original osteopathic model was a system of fluid dynamics, which AT still called the rule of the artery. Now, that tends to kind of get left behind in clinical practice by a lot of osteopaths, at least from a surface sort of observation, in that they tend to be looking at musculoskeletal complaints so much. But inherent within that is the delivery of nutrients through the vascular system and the removal of waste product through the lymphatic system. And I'm kind of intrigued as to when AT still came up with osteopathy back in the 1800s, just what was going through his mind, in that this thing is this thing that we call the body is a living, pulsating organism that has all sorts of allostatic regulatory control mechanisms built into it, which is all we're trying to foster when we treat, is to try and give the body what it needs in terms of structural integrity, give it the nutrition it requires, and the inputs it requires to health, and letting it figure it out, because we know that it can figure it out. We've seen the body do amazing things, from recovering from accidents and huge infections and people being on their deathbed to spontaneous recovery. And there are many inputs that the body uses as an energetic signal to do that, and then it has within it inherently the ability to figure it out, if you like. So our job is really to give the body what it needs to figure things out, rather than trying to shoehorn it into place with various medical intervention and so forth. And so with that background, I've gone on to study in anti-aging medicine with A5M, and that's now kind of led me to a point where I'm kind of, you know, mashing these two systems together and finding the commonalities between the two. And I think with the osteopathic mindset, and then overlaying some of the modern mitochondrial science and so forth, everything's kind of adding up and becoming clear to me in the way that it fits together. And it's fun. It's like a martial artist practices and is forever learning. I think it's the same thing in medicine. The minute we stop learning and lose our curiosity is the minute we're going to lose our way. So it's kind of nice to use a transcend but include model of, okay, here's the next thing I'm going to study, but I'm going to include the best of what I already know. And when you work that way, you tend to find that everything that you are currently holding on to as a perceived truth at that point in time does fit your overarching model. So
that's fantastic. Well, let's get into the model. I would love to hear where you're at with that integration.
Okay, so currently where I've landed myself is that we can look at all these different disease processes that happen in the body, and we can look at all the so-called optimal function that we see in bodies. And what tends to be the overarching umbrella model for me is the ability to acquire, make best use of, and efficiently direct energy within the body. So just like you mentioned Jack Cruz when we were just talking before we went live here, and you were part of his community, and so was I, which is how you came to learn of me. But one of the very first things that he said that resonated with me when I was first into his material is that a dead body is a body that's lost all of its energy, and a healthy one is the one that has optimal energy production, transference, and so forth. And he often used the analogy of a Ferrari versus like a Model T Ford. They're both cars. They both travel in a forward direction. They both use fuel that they turn into combustible energy to make the car go. But the Ferrari has many, many detailed built-in controls that make best use of any leakage of energy. So anything that's going to escape that combustible system and be lost, let's say as exhaust, I suppose, can actually get turned into further work. And the way I see the body working is that it's set up such that we make best use of energy when energy is available, and we store it when we don't have the immediate use for it. And anytime we have any leakage, a healthy body should be able to put that to further work rather than just emitting it. And so, having read a lot of other people in the field, I guess Ray Peat's made a real synthesis of a lot of the other pioneers in the bioenergetic work, I suppose. And having looked at all these people, they're all speaking the same language. They're just in different fields, if you like. And I think the totality of it we call like the bioenergetic model of health and disease, I suppose. So, as I said in the introduction, the most simple way to put it is a body with the most ability to create, use, and adequately direct energy as needed at that given point in time will be healthier than one that cannot do that. So then the model entails sort of looking at where the energy leaks are in the person. So this could be the inputs are poor. So the dietary inputs are poor, the photonic inputs, say from sunlight and so forth, are poor. The general energetic resonance in their friend circle may be poor, or in their relationships. So that's the input. Then within the body, there's the deficiencies that may come from nutritional deficiencies, then affecting the hardware of the way the body transmits, focuses, and redirects energy. That could be a problem. And then, of course, there's the outputs. How much is this person expending on various outputs of the body? So do they exercise too much? That could entail we're actually expending more energy than we're acquiring, so then we're going to create a disease state at some point in time. Are they working too much, and so forth? You can go on and on and on, but basically you can break it down to like the input, the ability to hold on to and adequately transfer energy, and the outputs. And these are all the things that must be considered when you're taking into consideration the overall bioenergetic state of an organism. So
yeah, well, let's start with these inputs. I love where you're going. So give us some examples of what these inputs are.
Okay, so obviously the first thing everyone thinks of when you speak to anybody who's not at all versed in medicine or metabolic science, they all think of food first of all, because it's an obvious input. You take something from the outside, you put it in your mouth, you chew it up, and eventually you'll excrete it out the other end. So it seems an obvious input and output, I guess. Well, that's one. So, but I don't know. I guess there's so much online and so much available to people now that this is sort of almost, I don't know whether it's even worth going into detail about.
Right. Let's move over that one.
So then I guess the next obvious one is to go back before food and look at, well, where does food actually come from? And if anyone has ever grown a vegetable garden, probably the first thing that you will know about it is that it only blooms certain things at certain times of the year. So what's the thing that changes that allows a different fruit to grow at a different time of the year to another fruit? Well, it happens to be the photonic input from the sun. So, and everything downstream of that, meaning temperature changes and so forth. So, just I guess here on this, you can see the bioenergetic model at work in deciduous trees like apples and pears and things like this, that they'll actually lose their leaves at times when there is a scarcity of the photonic input to their energy system. So during the winter time, a lot of trees will drop their leaves because these are expensive components of a tree to keep alive. And when we don't have enough energy to kind of run the entire system of the tree, we'll drop what's unnecessary at that given point in time. Now, our body works in much the same way, in that when energy is scarce, or there is an inability to convert energy from one substrate to another in us, and to adequately use and direct that energy, we'll drop systems that are seemingly less important for survival, and we'll prioritize other systems that are more important for survival at that given point in time. So I think when we talk about health, what we're really sidetracking here, but I think it's relevant, but what we're really talking about is the body's ability to adapt to any situation at any given point in time. And so in that way of thinking, health is actually a metastable. It's a metastable process where it's always changing given the situation that one is currently in. And so I guess on that as well, what we're really saying is no one is inherently sick. They're just subject to differing environments, which means that their physiology has to morph and change to best match that environment with what they have at that given point in time. So I've skipped away from the inputs and sort of gone on a tangent, but I think that's probably the way that I'd like to start, is to realize that when we're talking about health and disease, it's not a state that's there forever. It's actually a reflection of the demands on the body and whether those demands are exceeding the resources or not. And so then when we go back to the inputs, what we want to assume is that we're all in a stressful environment 24/7, because we're modern creatures in an alien environment, if you like, with many, many things, many, many forces and stresses acting on our system. So we do need to maximize the quality and the quantity of the inputs to our energy system, whilst also maximizing our ability to actually turn these inputs into usable energy currency for the body. So the food is an obvious one because, well, maybe not for all of your listeners, but food is ultimately broken down to charged particles that are pushed through little parts of the cell called mitochondria, and the charge gradient that pushes through the mitochondria, much like an electrical wire, creates some energy burst at the end in the form of ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and this is sort of our body's energy currency. So that then goes on to do many, many things in the body, but the large science behind it is that it unfolds our protein. So it gives rise to life, if you like. And this is why at the beginning I said any loss of energy, if we completely lose energy, we're dead. So the inability to make or hold on to any kind of ATP will result in an inert structure rather than a living one.
And can I just pause you there for a second, because I hear a lot of this talk in the fitness world around ketosis, and would this where ketosis fits in here at this point of ATP production?
Well, I just call ketosis a metabolic state, and one can go in and out of it if they're metabolically flexible enough. But my current understanding of it, and my practice is called Paleo Osteo Evolutionary Medicine Clinic, right? So I use these principles of evolutionary medicine that look at cultures that were not sick and the way in which people lived to their environment. And I contrast that with ways in which people now alter their environment to suit them. So when one looks at having to live to their environment, when a time of scarcity comes, any excess energy input from, say, food or whatever that is left over from the summertime in a hibernating animal then gets switched to like a fat-burning system during the winter, when one has to be doing very little and hibernating. So that entails a down-regulation of the physiology in a way, much like you want to, let's say you have your laptop open, your computer open, you have 32 apps open and the thing's chugging. We have to remove these apps that are open in order to maximize the CPU processing power of the computer. So when one is going into hibernation, you need to sort of ditch certain metabolic processes and certain functions of the body in order to survive on very little input. So back to the sunlight, let's say it's a hibernating bear, the sun's going to go away for a long period of time, the environment's going to get very, very cold. Well, the bear's going to down-regulate its metabolism and go to sleep for 6 months. And in doing so, it needs to switch its metabolic substrate input. So it's going to go from honey and fruit and fish and whatnot to using whatever it can store in its own body, which would be the body fat. And that would then put the bear in ketosis at least seasonally. Now, humans have a different metabolic plasticity. We don't hibernate, but to me, these ketotic states symbolize a slowing down of all processes of the body, at least for a period of time, where we can reserve certain functions in place of others that we may let go of transiently. So therapeutically speaking, when one is using ketosis, say for a brain problem like Alzheimer's or some sort of form of dementia, I think what's happening is the brain has actually lost its ability to use its primary fuel source of glucose. And so without the ability to transfer the electron from complex 1 of the mitochondria all the way through, we need a different input. So we can kind of cut in at complex 2 and sort of use a backdoor and keep metabolism cooking. I wouldn't say it's necessarily optimal because other things are going to happen as a result, but at least it allows metabolism to keep functioning when the use of sugar is compromised. So I see these things as something that should swing from sort of, complex 1 activity, i.e. glucose, to complex 2 and complex 1 activity with certain fats to pure complex 2 activity in mitochondria. So it's like there's 2 doors and 2 inputs into the mitochondria, and we can use one at any given point in time. And when we enter ketosis, we choose the second door more preferentially. So, I think they both produce energy in one way, shape, or form. And I think different things are suited to different environments, if you like.
Yeah. Well, let's circle back to the sun, and you mentioned this as being a primary input of energy into the system, and most people are thinking, well, I thought you already talked about sun via food, right? It's like, well, that's, you know what I'm saying?
So as we were saying, like different fruits, as the UV index climbs coming into summertime, and the infrared index also is climbing, and that gives you your heat from the sun, different fruits and vegetables tend to bloom. So it was more my example that that's a primary input to make a plant grow, because a plant will take a photon, which will be absorbed by the the chloroplast in the leaf, and then that basically puts a hydrogen onto a carbon and makes the plant grow. It's photosynthesis, basically. So that input ultimately gives rise to what we call food, which is either vegetables, or then this plant is then ingested by an animal, and then they're further converted that information from the sun into their own tissues. And it's no secret that if we don't get sunshine on our skin, we don't make things like vitamin D, we don't make melanin, and we just look sick. Everyone's seen that pasty white person that's never seen the sun. It just doesn't look healthy. And so again, with the evolutionary model, when someone looks healthy, they probably are, So it's, I don't know, these things just kind of make sense to me. They're things that my grandparents used to say. It shouldn't be new science. My grandparents used to say, if you're sick and you have a cold, drink this chicken soup that's full of nutrients and go and sit in the sun, and you would feel better. It should be just well known as the standard. It shouldn't be something that we have to teach people anymore, but unfortunately we're at this point in time where we're so fragmented that we've lost our innate wisdom about the way the world works, and that we're actually part of this cycle and not separate from it,
Yeah.
So it's a shame that we're even having to talk about this as an energy input when everybody knows when the sun comes out in spring after a dark winter, they feel better.
Well, can you unpack this direct exposure to the sun and how that's an input? I mean, you did kind of briefly mention vitamin D and melanin, but is there it's sort of a leading question because I kind of know a little bit about this, but it's for the listeners. I mean, tell us how we harness those photons.
So water in the body particularly is probably one of the main capture devices, particularly for the infrared light, which is the heat spectrum of light, really, from red all the way up through. So most people have heard of infrared sauna. It's very hot when you go in there. Well, the summertime sun has the same kind of effect, as we all know. That's why we enjoy summer more than winter. So have you discussed with your listeners previously Gerald Pollack's work or anything like that?
No, it'd be a good idea to bring that up briefly.
Okay, so Pollack's a water scientist. I think he's based in the Pacific Northwest.
University of Washington.
Washington, is it? Yeah. So they've done a bunch of experiments on water and sort of phase transitions of water, whereby application of an exposure to light to some molecules of water will result in like a charge separation of the molecules of water. So essentially what's required is some sort of hydrophilic substance. So it could be, a glass bottle or something like that houses the water. Something that is water loving, where water doesn't bead on the surface, but more just slides around and moves freely on that surface. So in us, that medium is collagen, or our own tissues. And then the application of the light actually sets up this charge separation where all the negative ions tend to stack around the surface of where the water's sitting against this hydrophilic surface, and the positive ions tend to accumulate in the middle. So if you imagine that it was like a hose and you had a cross-section of hose, as you're looking down the tube of the hose, you have all the negative ions around the outside and all the positive ions of the water on the inside. And this I guess this gradient between the two charges actually sets up like a free motility through the tube. So one of Pollock's students actually put some Nafian tube inside a beaker of water or a large tub of water and shone some light on it. And he said there started becoming this gradient of push through this tube where the water was just freely moving with no other energy input other than the light. And when they switched the light off, the water continued to move through the tube for a number of hours afterwards, I believe it was. So it's clear then that light in a water-bearing system like we are, 80% water or so, has a direct energy input that sets up motility in our body. So the importance of that to me comes back to A.T. Still, the founder of osteopathy, and his rule of the artery and fluid dynamics within the body. So without proper fluid dynamics in the body, deliverance of new nutrition, removal of waste tissue, and the cycle continues like it should through a mountain stream, you're going to get stasis of fluid in the body, and anytime there's stasis, there'll be disease. So I tend to think of it like, as I said, a mountain stream. You've got this beautiful clear water pouring down the mountain, but if you dam that up and you put some logs across that water and you really stop the flow and you house it in, only it takes a number of weeks before that water is actually murky and full of mosquitoes and larvae and nonsense in the water. It's the exact same thing in our body. If we lose that control of flow through the body, of the fluids and the various things that course through the arterial system and the venous system and the lymphatic system, we get stasis. And most people would drink from a mountain spring stream that's pouring down the mountain, looks clear as anything, but not many people would drink from the dammed water that's all murky and full of crap. It's the same thing in our body. When we have stasis, we get disease and we get accumulation of detritus that then must be cleared. This puts a stress on the immune system and so on and so forth. So back to the light is that red light absorption by water is actually setting up free motility in our body. So is it then any wonder when that sun hits in spring and everyone wants to go outside and they get the warm sun on their skin, they feel better in general. Everything just feels better. People feel more sociable, people feel healthier, people start to glow again. They're getting sort of a new input of free energy to the system. The impacts of UV light are probably less in my area of expertise in the way that it actually adds to the system, but water also absorbs UV spectra at the same time and has many other functions in the body, but reading somebody like Cruz would probably be a bit more of a direct way to learn about the effects of UV. We tend to only hear about the damaging effects of UV, but it does tend to have a sterilizing kind of process on things. So most people are aware that if they went to the dentist, for example, there's like an autoclave where all the tools will go into the autoclave and they're exposed to high density UV light, which will sterilize the equipment. So there's obviously an effect there for getting rid of mold toxins and bacterial stuff, and but this is not my area of expertise really. I mean, like I said at the beginning, this is stuff that I just think everyone should know the take home rather than the deep science of, because we can get really bogged down in the deep science of just how everything works. But at the end of the day, the take home message is get in the sun.
Yeah. So this, I would like to distinguish for the listeners too that actually red light in the visible spectrum of red has slightly different effects than in the infrared A range. Is that something you can talk about a little bit?
Yeah, the main documented effect, especially when you're talking about like red light therapy or photobiomodulation, which I guess is where we're leading to with this question, is both of these areas, all the way from red to infrared, tend to have the same effect on mitochondria, which is the complex in mitochondria known as cytochrome C oxidase, which is where oxygen flows through at the end of the respiratory chain, is liberated or stimulated by red and infrared light as well. Now, red and infrared light have different penetrations into the body. Red light around the 660 sort of nanometer range, which is commonly used in many devices, penetrates about a centimeter and a half, and infrared can penetrate sometimes, or infrared's a spectrum, so as you said, there's A and B. closer to red probably penetrates 2 to 3 centimeters, and closer to the infrared starting to penetrate 4 to sometimes 6 centimeters. But so largely the documented effect is on liberating the mitochondrial respiration chain, namely at cytochrome C. And the job there is that it liberates sort of overt amounts of nitric oxide that can accumulate there. I guess the way I've always seen this is nitric oxide can be a savior, but it can also be something that can kill you. And I guess the nitric oxide initially is there to try and deliver more oxygen by any means possible, because it's a vasodilator, and it also contributes to production of new blood vessels. So I'm guessing what happens is there's some sort of decrease in oxygen to an area. Nitric oxide is stimulated to try and open the arteries to get more juice there, if you like. But over a period of time, this consistent production of nitric oxide clogs that area up. And it's red light that can liberate that nitric oxide from cytochrome C, thus restoring the flow of oxygen and electrons through that area in order to ultimately create more energy. And, energy structure and function being interrelated at every level, then we have, better tissue control, better repair mechanisms, better growth, et cetera, et cetera. So
now there is a relationship in part of this frequency range to what the mitochondria are producing itself, right, at the end of this. Is that true?
In terms of their ATP production?
Well, in terms of infrared A.
Oh, infrared A. So depending on the uncoupling haplotype of the individual, which essentially refers to, how much. This is back to the wastage thing, if you like, as well, that I was mentioning with the cars. That mitochondria are also making their own heat, and they can liberate any of these excess electrons that would otherwise be turned into ATP as heat when they're loosely coupled, meaning they can uncouple from respiratory ATP production and say, well, we've got too much input coming through here. Let's liberate some of this excess as heat, which is then absorbed by the water in the surrounding tissues and put to further work. So as I was mentioning earlier, anytime there's overload, one can turn it into heat. That heat can then affect the water, and we can actually be using that excess energy, if that makes any kind of sense to the way I've described it.
Yeah, right. Well, this is sort of the mechanic behind doing cold water training, essentially what you're talking about.
Yeah. For those who are able to uncouple, that's fantastic. Some people can't uncouple, and they might get out of the water and shiver all night and just trying to recover that energy from somewhere by inducing shivering effect to try and get the body temperature back up. Myself, I uncouple quite well. If I eat too much, like let's say I eat a huge meal and it's very rich food, I'll just be sweating because my mitochondria are able to say, hey, I can't work that fast to turn all of this stuff into ATP for you. So I'm going to uncouple some of this energy and liberate it as heat. And so I can get very, very hot after a meal and be sweating, and you could probably feel my temperature from a meter away. Whereas some people might eat too much and just basically go off and go to sleep, and their body temperature wouldn't change at all. That would be someone who can't uncouple as well as someone like me, perhaps. Whether that can be trained or not, I'm actually not sure. It's claimed that it can, but I have not seen any direct evidence of that myself, save for people actually talking about it on the internet.
Yeah, well, it's so sort of some people may be thinking, well, how would I know? How would I know if I couple well or uncouple well? And the prevailing way to determine that, other than just going into the cold and seeing how you feel, which I don't think is a really good way to test that, because everybody's going to be cold when you go into the cold. Is the mitochondrial ancestry. It's the haplotype, right?
That's right. That's why I think it probably has more to do with that than anything. And I'm sure that could probably be trained to a mild degree over a period of time as one adapts to their environment. But as I said, I haven't seen much evidence of it happening. And how do I know this person's haplotype isn't that way geared in the first place? So.
Yeah. So, and just as a little background for haplotype, this is essentially where in the world your mitochondria have evolved over time. And the further you are away from the equator, the more uncoupled your mitochondria have evolved to be. Therefore, you can adapt to cold and extreme climate change in
Yeah,
what Josh was talking about earlier.
that's exactly, yeah. Because you are kind of required to have that haplotype in order to survive, So body temperature is sometimes more important than ATP production, particularly if you're a hibernating kind of people, such as the Inuit and so forth. Is that during the winter time when there's scarcity and there's snow everywhere, it's very, very hard to get around. So you have to expend a lot of energy to do anything. And at the end of the day, it's probably better to stay inside the igloo and just hang out. And for that reason, you want a haplotype that can uncouple and generate body heat for survival during that period, because you don't really need so much working energy in the form of ATP because you're not doing as much. So contrast that with somebody around the equator, like, Jamaica is probably a good example. I mean, is it any wonder they have such profound athletic prowess? Because everything this person ingests can be turned into straight mechanical energy in the form of ATP. So, a sprinting haplotype is what's derived there, because they're more tightly coupled, and everything that's coming through that electron transport chain, you can almost think of it like a hose. So I'm going to blow a certain amount of water through a hose, and I got to get it from one end to the other. Usain Bolt's haplotype gets all of that water to the other end, and an uncoupling haplotype is like blowing it through one of those hoses that have the little holes in the top so that they can form like a little spray system. So as I'm blowing that water, some of it's escaping through the hose, and that escape will be liberated as the heat, whereas the tightly coupled haplotype will be taking the energy that's at this end of the hose and transferring it straight to the other end, which is where ATP is produced. And so more of their energy is going towards, mechanical work, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah. Well, I think the point that is that's still kind of confounding me is this is seen as waste, heat, right? It's sort of like if you're a biochemist looking at the process of the mitochondria, you're going, oh, well, waste is the waste product of heat is like we're trying to there's this mindset that one would want to decrease that from happening. But if you're a physicist and you're looking at that, you're basically looking at it as infrared. You're looking at it as infrared light. And now we're back to the whole charging the water of your body and using that as a way. There's a total reframing that needs to happen around this, I think. And everyone's missing the point in talking about ATP. Not that that's not important, but I think this is highly undervalued.
Well, see, ATP is just like it's only a currency of energy in our body. It's a symbol that represents the amount of energy that has come in, right? So it's kind of like taking US dollars and, crossing the border to Canada, and you've got to change the currency. So within our body, certain things demand the use of ATP as our primary currency, but that's not to say that other energy affecting the body in a different way is still not energy. It's just not coded for as ATP. It's still energy, and heat is just energy. And so all that's happening here is the energy transfer from the outside, being sun on food and things like this, coursing through, and even from other people, even their attitudinal energy can affect you. So when you're around these different vibrations, if you like, our body is able to kind of capture the vibration and turn them into something that is coded for in our own body that we can make sense of. And the liberation of heat, as you said before, it was previously seen as waste, or in the car analogy, it's just like, extra exhaust coming out the back as kind of soot and smoke, and it's just wastage. But our body's very elegantly set up with this water that captures this. So like we mentioned before, the infrared light's actually captured by water, and it's put to further work. And that further work is this splitting of the atomic structure of water and setting up all these kind of movement gradients through the body. Which, again, it makes sense. When one is moving, probably everybody knows, if you have lymphatic pooling in a foot after a broken ankle, if you sit there and do nothing, it pools and you have this fat ankle. Well, movement flushes lymph. This is why movement is so good for any kind of disease where we have all this pooling of stuff, much like the river analogy that's been dammed. If we move, we actually flush these tissues of that detritus, and things move on and become cyclical again. Well, if we have an uncoupling haplotype and we don't move so much, we can get that free motility of water just through the heat being absorbed by the water in our body. So it kind of all makes sense to me when you see it this way, because evolutionarily speaking, it just makes sense.
Right.
You want to use heat to push the fluids around your body when you don't have the benefit of movement, because it's cold and it's hard to walk in snow, for example, and so forth. And so we need a different way to get that job done. So it's very elegantly set up, from what I can see, to make use of whatever it's got at that point in time. And if it's if it's liberating heat, that gets put to further work. So there's really no escape in a system like this. There's no escape for energy unless something bad happens.
Well, I would like to continue the thread one more point to photobiomodulation, which is something that you do at your clinic. And tell us about this. I want one, Josh. Is it awesome?
It's cool. It's a photobiomodulation pod, so a whole body application for red and infrared light, and many devices on the market for spot treatment of things like a tennis elbow, where there's inflammation of the elbow and there's breakdown of tissue. So you can apply this light to your elbow, and we have that effect on cytochrome C, and we have increased energy production and a recapturing of the structure of the elbow, and inflammation goes away and it heals. So there's many of these sort of spot devices, both at the consumer level and at the pro level for clinicians and so forth, which are very expensive. And we've developed a whole body pod that you can subject an entire individual to, so you can have that effect throughout the system. Because I've used these handheld devices, and in practice I actually find it quite boring just standing there holding my hand against someone's elbow. I prefer to be feeling things and moving things and kind of getting a feel for this person hands-on. And it's much better if I don't have to be there and the client can come and lie in the bed for half an hour and go away later on. But using that as an adjunct to all the other principles that we use at practice has been a fantastic way to get that input, to liberate the mitochondria, to get it pumping again and get it working like the little engine that it is. It's been an awesome adjunct, yeah. So as you were saying, that's just the application of this red and this near infrared that we discussed before, and it's absorbed, by the body, lying either naked or in underwear in the bed, just absorbing those photons and letting the body figure itself out from there. A lot of people are missing these frequencies, and I think it's actually almost drowned out. Not only are they missing it, but even if someone is going in the sun, for 3 hours a day, they're often then spending the rest of the day on a computer just drenched in blue light. So it's almost like from their total intake of light for the day, 80% of that is blue, and only 20% might be red, infrared, yellow, and all the other stuff that's in the sun. So in the broad scheme of things, it's like somebody saying, yeah, but I eat my vegetables and I eat organic. Yeah, but that's 20% of the time. The other 80% of the time you eat McDonald's. So just because you eat 20% of the time, does that really mean you're getting the benefit in the grand context of your total input of light? And I think that's really where it's fallen down, even between the 80s and now. Like in the 1980s, if you were inside all day, okay, you're in front of a screen, let's say, it just didn't seem as totally blue back then. Those old CRT monitors and TV, it just didn't seem as extreme now as what it is then as what it is now. Like I drive around town sometimes and you see inside someone's window when they don't have the curtains drawn, and it's just a glow of blue inside. I don't remember it looking that bad when I was a kid if you saw inside someone's house. So there's a real change in the kind of light spectra, and I think it's the use of LEDs, which are very, very narrow band light, that's tending to kind of drown us with different frequencies. And so I think the application of this red in its purest form now is very important, because, as I said, it only makes up a sliver of what we're seeing each day. Whereas if you saw nothing but sunlight all day and you lived outside, out of the total 100% of photonic input, let's divide it up into 5, 20%'s UV, 20%'s blue, 20%'s yellow through orange, 20%'s red, 20%'s infrared. Well, now we're only getting that 20% of red in 20% of our total full spectrum light input. So it's a very, very tiny sliver of input of those frequencies to the body. And so I think when you really drown someone in this stuff, in the red and the infrared, you get a profound effect very quickly. As if the body's saying, yes, I know this, I want this frequency here, and I know how to use it, so thank you very much for delivering it. And that's been the beauty of the pod, really.
Fantastic. Let's head back to your discussion of inputs beyond the sun.
So I guess the next thing that I often consider with my clients is their relationships and the people around them, and just the vibrational energy of their environment. So what's the best way to describe this? Probably for me, because I was a musician, is going into a gig or a show or something like that where everyone is purely there to see that artist play. Right, so everyone is there vibrating on the same energy level because they have a commonality. Now, you cannot match the energy that's inherent in a gig when you walk in there and this artist starts playing, because everyone's resonating on the same frequency, not only of the music that they know and love, but they're in a place together with like-minded individuals and they're vibing. Now, everybody knows as well, when they're with their best friends who really get them, they feel better than when they're in a pack of strangers. Okay, so something's happening here that's affecting our energy levels, and I think it's vibrational energy, and that's another input that we can control, but many people don't control it or don't consider that it is within their control, and they will settle for being around things that negatively impact them in this way. So choosing people that lift you up, choosing people that make you feel amazing to hang out with all the time, addressing these sorts of things is really important for relationships and really important for health. So I guess I see a lot of people clinically who have been to a lot of doctors who have spoken about a lot of deep science and a lot of things that they got to avoid and be fearful of, and you got to watch out for this, you got to watch out for that, and they'll feel guilty if they even eat a teaspoon of sugar one day or something, and it's negatively, adversely affecting their health. And oftentimes the first thing I've got to say is you need to stop worrying. Worry is doing more to you than sugar ever will. So these sorts of things, I think, they're left a bit untapped in health circles, and they're kind of left to the consciousness yoga meditation people, but there's no reason that there needs to be a divide between the two, which is why I like what you're doing, because it's everything. Our conscious awareness of things is everything. Like, everything ultimately appears, is contained in and is made of consciousness. So then why are we ignoring this?
Yeah, exactly. And I love when epigeneticists start talking about, they think they're into some cutting edge work when they're talking about environmental signals like non-native EMF. And I'm thinking in my head, what is the most pervasive, ubiquitous signal that the cell is receiving? It's one's own consciousness.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
So foundational that we can't even see it. And if you are running around with negative emotions all the time, or interacting, as you say, with people who are feeding that, you are sending an epigenetic signal.
Exactly. I've often said to clients when I start talking about this stuff, and I kind of see their eyes glaze over as if, oh, Josh has gone crazy. What's he talking about now? Well, I use this example of if you're in a room and you hear the door open behind you, it could be someone you don't like, and you don't even have to turn around, but someone's in the house that you don't like. The difference 20 feet from your back, whether it's someone you're a friend with or it's your enemy. You just can feel it. And no one denies that they can feel that. And yet people start to think you're crazy when you talk about wave transference from one person to another in terms of their energetic vibration. So you can't have it both ways. You either agree that this can negatively, adversely impact you, or it can make you feel amazing, or you don't. So we don't really need to know the science of why. Let's just get back to our consciousness that it exists in pure awareness. We all know. We don't need it written in a journal to make us believe it.
Yeah.
There's disconnect there, I think, and I don't know, it frustrates me a little bit.
Yeah, I happen to live in Silicon Valley, where I am talking to a lot of people that want to see some kind of a study, or they want to see evidence for this. And I usually just point them to HeartMath, because they have done such a good job of showing how emotions affect the autonomic nervous system and heart rate variability, and but the biofeedback of being able to see what kind of an effect that has in terms of efficiency in the system, which is one of the things that you're talking about. You're talking about not only getting the right inputs, but managing the energy once it's in the system. And so this is the gas mileage, like how many miles per gallon are you getting with that energy source that you've just worked so hard to get?
Yeah, exactly. And I guess since we're talking about things being documented, I wouldn't mind actually kind of like jumping over to, lab values that people, when they try and quantify their health and so forth. Because I've recently been using another metaphor or analogy, which I'm always using, because we're dealing with lay people all the time. It's helpful to kind of explain things in this way so that, everyone kind of gets what you're talking about. So I'm often saying the lab value is only an indication of what your body's trying to do given its current scenario. So the one I like to use is a boat on a lake, right? So there's a yacht on a lake, and let's say there's a cocktail party on that yacht. The cocktail party participants are the lab numbers or the various biomarkers. So if that boat starts to sink at one end and starts to drop into the water, we can't stay spread around the boat talking happily. We all have to run to the other end so that the boat will even out on the water. So the running to the other end is the scattering of lab results into so-called abnormal ranges, right? But they're going to abnormal ranges to save your bloody life so that the boat can reset itself to being flat on the water and we don't sink and fall in. So the traditional medicine way of treating somebody is to just shoehorn these lab values back into normal ranges chemically. So if we do that, we're basically saying, no, run back down to the other end of the boat that's underwater. It's okay. Chemically, push back down there. And the whole system is sinking, but it's okay because on paper in the clinic, you look healthy. And I'm just constantly being sent these patients with all this chemical activity going on in their body from medications. And they're just flat out getting off the waiting room chair and into my office. Like it's 5 meters away and they're just dead getting into the office. And the doctor says, but they're healthy because look at the lab values. Well, in your own awareness, this person is not healthy. Look, how do you feel? I feel like shit, but my labs are normal. So something else is wrong with me. No, your lab values have been told what to do and it's completely incoherent with the state of affairs, So another frustration then with the people we consult with is they go through all these whiz-bang doctors on the net and they get all these labs and they bring me these almanac of labs and say, it's all in here. And I'm like, no, it's all right here in front of me. Talk to me. I don't care. I want to burn these notes. I want to throw these on a fucking fire and get rid of them because you're living your life by these values that are only an indicator of the state that you're in. So tell me about the state that you're in, And, again, to just flip back to what you're saying with the Silicon Valley people, I guess the way that I would normally answer that when they want to see a study is to come to the realization of where reading this study is occurring, right? So you're reading these letters printed on paper. That's happening in consciousness as well. So why do we trust reading that happens in consciousness more than we trust feeling that happens in consciousness, right? So
I love that.
The real for these patients is, how do you feel? I feel like shit. Well, then if you've got a roadmap and you're trying to go from Canada to Mexico and you realize you're like up around the Arctic Circle, you don't change your trajectory only like 5 degrees. You need to do a 180-degree turnaround and get the fuck back to Mexico. And that's, if you find yourself in ill health, one has to only look at the things that they've subjected themselves to for so long. And then it doesn't take a genius to realize that's what's got me here. So I can't keep on this same path if I want to get better. I actually need to do some things differently. And making that choice is, unfortunately for humans, it takes for us to get to complete rock bottom, complete failure until we can completely turn around. So the good thing about podcasts such as this and this community that we're all a part of is that people are starting to realize when things are just a little bit not quite right and wanting to explore that. So I think there's been a real crazy shift in the last 5 years with all these communities that we're all a part of in helping people realize what is not quite right and what is good, and then looking around and saying, well, what am I doing that is not quite right that's making me feel this way? Or what am I subjecting myself to? Is it this person in my life? Or is it this, bucket of soda that I drink every day? Or is it that? But everyone wants to choose the obvious food, but no one's choosing these people or the stuck inside all day or the weather and blah, blah, blah. So bringing awareness to that and just seeing that the body only reads and reacts to its environment is so important for health, So whatever it is around you has an energetic input. or takes an energetic toll. And it's all give and take and energy transference. And you know, the physicists would say energy can't be created or destroyed, only transferred. So if we take that notion, well, there's only a certain amount to kind of go around. It has to be pushed and pulled and harnessed and let go when it needs to be let go and not otherwise. Which is, again, comes under that umbrella model of the bioenergetic view that the more you can contain and adequately distribute to a very, very tightly regulated point, the better you will do. I'm tangenting again, sorry.
Yeah, all good. So I got dietary, obviously, sun, relationships, or we'll just say kind of consciousness to kind of, other humans and one's own response to them. Anything else quickly that you would put into this category of inputs?
I think that pretty much rolls it all together, the obvious things.
So yeah. I'd like to ask you to discuss the alignment, structure, and how that plays a role, because I'm assuming since it's not an input, it's more about efficiency and management of energy.
Yeah, I would say it's about efficiency, and what we would say is in the clinic it's a bit of a catchphrase, but you want no escape. So essentially we're an upright creature, a bipedal upright creature, right? So we're trying to organize ourselves against gravity. Now, the more efficiently we can stack our system against gravity, to mean if I'm just, let's say I'm just standing all day at I don't know where. Let's just say I've got to stand all day. I want to stand with the least amount of expenditure on my system in terms of ATP use as possible. So that would kind of comprise like a system that's perfectly weighted and balanced on, I won't call them, they used to call them static structures, right? Like the collagen and the ligaments. They used to call them static structures when I was at school, but I actually don't think they're static. They're living tissue as well. I don't like the term, but for the sake of the explanation, I'll use it. You want to be resting into your static slings, which are basically the collagen envelopes around the joints and the musculature. They actually hold everything together. They're actually the structure of the body. But you want them to be expending the least possible energy as you can. And in movement, you want to be transferring the most of the energy that you're trying to put into walking forward. Now, I'll stand up and I'll show you an example, and the listeners won't hear it because it's audio only, but hopefully I'll try and annotate it as I'm doing it, and maybe they can get it. So I'm standing up here, and I'm fairly balanced between sides. So when I'm going to take a step forward, I want my right foot to step forward on my left hand, and I want my midline to sort of almost be looking exactly the same. There's a slight twist of the shoulder girdle one way, and a slight concurrent twist of the pelvic girdle the other way. So it's like a corkscrewing type motion. Then as I take that step, I want all of the energy being put into the step to transfer to the left foot stepping forward and the right hand stepping forward with no escape in the trunk. Now, if I take that step and I'm not well balanced or I can't adequately control my center, as I take the step with the left foot and I escape like this, so I'm side bending to the right, so I've lost some structural integrity on this side through either a postural alignment problem or, well, now my energy is actually transferring out into my left hip because I've collapsed here. So I've actually lost energy in the forward momentum, and I've lost it into a side bending and a lateral momentum. So that would comprise an escape of movement energy, if you like, which ultimately leads to a very inefficient gait pattern. So if I have to walk 10 kilometers tomorrow and 30% of my energy is escaping laterally, I'm going to be very tired by the end of 10 kilometers. Whereas if all of my energy has been transferred into the forward motion because it's adequately controlled in the posture, I'm going to be a much more efficient being. I'm going to have less musculoskeletal aches and pains, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a hard thing to describe on an audio only, but I guess you got a snapshot of what I was doing because I was standing up in the camera and doing it for you. But postural alignment and control through our innate stabilizing function is extremely important for the overall health because it's just another leak if we're expending energy we don't need to.
Now, do you ever get into alignment as it may block or unblock energy flow, like electron flow, sort of like meridian electron flow type scenarios.
Absolutely. And so again, this is kind of where a lot of the disciplines that I both read and practice kind of superimpose on one another, is because, like, let's say what you just said is kind of like, how does this alignment affect like a meridian or an energy flow through collagen? Well, it's in the same way that it affects the movement input, and it's in the same way that all the quantum stuff and all these superimposition of all these different models, they're actually all talking the same language. But they're just coming at it from different disciplines, is I guess what I'm finding out. And so to me, I've not come up with, but the synthesis of all this stuff to me is this umbrella that contains all of it, which is bioenergetics in general. But quite correct, any kind of like structural dysfunction around, let's say, the lateral line on the right will probably coincide with some sort of gallbladder dysfunction in the Chinese system, because that's where its channel flows, is down the side of the body, from the lateral ankle all the way to the head and the temporal region here. So, yeah, quite correct. And my understanding is that the meridian system are actually these sorts of defined collagen superhighways throughout the body, which transfer energy at a rate much faster than the neural rate of flow from, say, the toe through the nervous system to the brain. It's something like 100 times as fast. So this is why you can stand on a tack and your right shoulder might jerk up like this before you even know what you've done, or why you touch a hot element and you pull your hand away before you even know it's hot. This is all energy transfer and information transfer through collagen and through the water system. And I don't know if you'll have show notes for this, but there's a fantastic video on YouTube called, let me just think of what it's called, Strolling Under the Skin.
Yeah.
Have you seen it? It's by some French.
Well, I saw it from a reference that you made in another podcast.
Yeah. I mean, you look at this living collagen. When you do dissection, and most people who eat meat will know what this stuff looks like, but if you get a lamb shank, for example, you get this shiny kind of white filmy stuff around it. It's a real tough structure, which is why you got to cook the lamb shank for so long to make it soft. You have to break down the collagen. Well, that's nothing like collagen in a real body. Collagen in a real living body is this crazy plastic, it's gel-like, it's almost like a bloody plasma state, like the way in which it can move and twist and separate from itself and rejoin seamlessly. It's almost, I don't even know how to describe it. Like, it's a crazy different kind of thing. And in this video, Strolling Under the Skin, these French osteopaths put like a little filament camera in somebody's forearm underneath the skin between the muscle layer and the fascia of the skin, and you can see this collagen sort of morph and twist as they rub the musculature on top, rub the skin on top, and move the skin around. You just see the way this stuff actually works, and you think the most sophisticated technology in the world for energy transfer could not come up with this, And so it's an extremely important structure for everything. It's the packing tape that holds the body together. It's what gives rise to our structure. If you took it away somehow, you wouldn't be able to do this without killing a person. But if you took it all away from a cadaver, you could not stand the cadaver up. Well, you couldn't anyway, because there's no energy coursing through it. So it's kind of like these energy superhighways that give rise to energetic capacity in the body. That is what life is. It's an amazing structure. And I never forget being at university and doing these dissections, and you're hearing all these osteopaths in the other classes saying, we're obsessed with fascia and this is the most amazing structure in the universe and blah, blah, blah. And you get into the anatomy lab and they say, now, in order to show the gluteus medius, you have to take out all this collagen. And so you're pulling all this stuff out that in the other classes you're being told is the substance of life just to show this stupid muscle. You got to pull out all this pesky white shit. And I just thought, what?
Yeah.
Oh, it's so amazing, and then just got to get rid of it all.
When I teach anatomy and teacher training, we use the Essential Anatomy app, which is a good app for looking at individual muscles, the system. But you're seeing a very reductive view of the system, and if you it's like, where's the fascia, right? It's like, where's the fascia in this musculoskeletal system that we're looking at here? And it's like, oh, well, there it is in the Achilles tendon, or there it is in this ligament. And actually, it's everything. It's more like the muscles exist within the fascia than the fascia are these little pieces of like hardened tissue at the ends of the muscles or in between the bones.
My friend Philip Beach is an osteopath and acupuncturist in New Zealand. He has a fantastic book called Muscles and Meridians. And one of the very first things he says, it's actually in a direct challenge to Thomas Myers, the anatomy trains guy. But he puts up this photo of Dennis Lilly, who's a famous Australian cricket player, fast bowler. And he says, what muscles is this guy using? And he's in full flight, like in the air, about to, bowl the ball. He says, what muscles is he using? And everyone in the crowd goes silent, like, oh, fuck it, I don't know, all of them. And he says, is it all of them, or is this whole body functioning as one integrated unit where nothing is separate? And the body doesn't know biceps tendon, and it doesn't know rectus femoris, and it doesn't know sartorius. It just knows itself as a whole, and it doesn't care for names. So if the body itself, which is performing all these sophisticated tasks that we can't possibly model in a robot, it can't be mechanical. It's not strictly mechanical like they teach in anatomy, It's this whole integrated organism that knows itself via pure expression of movement without regard for which joint's moving first, or you understand what I'm saying? It's like, if you go to baseball, you don't think, now have to pivot on right foot, that entails internal rotation of right hip. Now I've got to pull this arm across my body. Now this one has to lift, and I've got to use biceps to pull. You don't think like, the brain is not doing it like that. And so none of it matters. None of it even matters, this anatomy. It's a nice thing to kind of have a certificate on the wall to say you understand it, but in reality, it doesn't fucking matter. Like, my clients are often saying, what muscle are you on there? When I'm working, what muscle are you on? What's that? And I just say, I don't care anymore. I can tell you, but it doesn't change anything. It doesn't matter what muscle it is, what it's called. All that matters is this area of your body is ambiguous at your brain level, and therefore it feels tight and sore and horrible. It doesn't matter what it's called, and it's not like a car where it's the carburetor that needs replacing or the oil pump or something. It's the whole thing just knows itself by a pure expression of consciousness, form, and movement. And that's all that matters. Is that any incoherence in that understanding is going to result in dysfunction.
That's a really intriguing point you just made there. And I think you said something like it's ambiguous to the brain. That would reflect itself as pain or tightness, right, on a more gross level. Can you explain that more?
Yeah, so when we're born, the nervous system is immature, which is why when the infant is under 3 months of age, it's at the mercy of where the parents put it, on the floor or on the couch or where it's got a dumb nervous system that has to develop over a period of time. But the nervous system contains software for mapping the body, basically. It's innate, it's already in there. And we know that because the same developmental patterns happen in every infant, whether they grow up in Africa or China or Canada or wherever. The same infantile patterns emerge that basically subject the body to positions on the floor that use certain structures as support structures. Right? So different pressure on the forearm from the hand, example, registers at the brain level. This is my right hand, this is my forearm. This can be used as a support to lift my head off the floor so I can look at my mother or father. So what I'm saying is the brain only knows the body through secondhand information, right? So the brain's just sitting up here as a central processing unit, and it doesn't know anything about where you are in space until you touch something. This is why I think flotation tanks and things where you don't know where you are quite weird in terms of like your awareness, and they have people have these profound experiences in there because their kind of brain's idea of where their body is ambiguous because they can't fucking feel it. They're floating and there's no direct information coming into the brain. So back to the development, because that process is already innate and it relies on stimulation of reflexes within the nervous system to kind of compute and code for movement later on, we're inputting all this stuff that tells us what this body does and how it can work through direct experience of the limb unfolding these developmental positions. For example, like at 3 months, you're either prone on the floor or you're supine on the floor. And what's happening is the only thing that you're really aware of is the diaphragm at that stage, which is your main breathing muscle, but it's also the pressure regulator of the abdominal cavity, or the true core, if you like. So intra-abdominal pressure through inspiration and the diaphragm kind of pushing down like a jellyfish would swim. This is how it moves, right? So as it's pushing down, it's creating intra-abdominal pressure at the same time that it draws air in. Intra-abdominal pressure stabilizes the thoracolumbar spine, off which one of the hip flexors, the psoas major, comes. So until that spine is actually stable as a reference point, the child can't even lift a leg off the floor. So it just shows us that the understanding of the body at the brain level from a mechanical or a movement perspective is actually, it's inherent, but it requires adequate pure inputs. So, if you put a baby in one of these suspended sort of like walkie things before it's ready to be an upright baby, you can completely demolish its movement patterns as an adult. So you're giving the wrong information at the wrong time before everything's been computed and understood. And when you demolish a movement pattern, what's happening is certain areas that required pure input to become clear at the brain level become ambiguous or not well understood by the brain because it hasn't developed properly. And so you can expect dysfunction in these muscles like trigger points, you can expect range of motion issues, you can expect pain, because if it's not understood where each limb is floating in space and how it's used to stabilize rotation of the trunk and pelvis, how can it be used properly if it's not understood? It can't be used in its pure form if it's not well understood. And so with the DNS model, which is this developmental postural stability model from the Prague school that we integrate in the practice, you take the person back to these developmental postures in order to give it pure information again. And when it's spotted and the person's in pure, unadulterated sort of posture, as is stimulated in infancy before concepts even exist, the information to the brain is so pure that the brain now understands the body. And so when this person walks out, they're like, holy shit, my pain's gone. We didn't touch your muscles. We didn't do anything to these trigger points. We didn't needle them. We didn't deep soft tissue them. We gave your brain better information about its inputs from the limbs and about its trunk and what stabilizes the trunk. And then it says, okay, trigger point, you don't need to be on anymore. And everything just kind of resets itself. So it's kind of like this, the more pure the input, the more pure the output, you know what I mean? So, and then there's no ambiguity at the brain level about like, am I here, am I there, am I using this limb correctly? Because we go back to development, which happens without concept. So it's not subject to opinion whether this is right or not. It just is, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
If an infant between 0 years of age and 13 months doesn't know anything about concepts, all it knows is experience, then this unfolding is through pure experience. And it gives it all the software it needs to be an upright creature with no trigger points.
I want to ask you another question, but I'm fearing that we're going to go much longer than an hour, so I want to respect your time here. Well, so maybe you can shed some light on this. You know, I've been reading Robert O. Becker and Body Electric and his discussion about muscles being piezoelectric, and that when they contract, they release electrons into this fascial system, and that this sort of constitutes some of the energetic pathway and some of the energy source that the body can utilize. And I've always wondered, is it only contraction? If you were to stretch the muscle with the same amount of pressure that you're contracting the muscle, would you also release the same amount of electrons? Do you have any thoughts on that?
It's been a long time since I've read that book, but I do recall discussions about this when I was at university. Like, what is actually, someone was curious enough as a student to say, what is actually happening when we do this that makes a physiological change? Why does just stretching and being in a yoga posture, for example, let's say triangle pose, why does it energize my groin and my whole sort of inner channel of the thigh and all this? So why do I feel so different everywhere from doing this pose. And they talked about this piezoelectric charge differential, and I think stretching does that. I do. I really don't think concentric contraction does, because if you cut the spinal cord, like if you see someone with a huge whiplash injury that basically cuts them off at the brainstem level, the entire body distal to that goes into spastic paralysis, which is concentric contraction. And it is locked on. Like it is, I treat a kid who had a stroke at age 2 or something like that at work, and his arms are just locked in this concentric, flexion, internal rotation, adduction like this. And all the strength in my body can't pull it open. And that's with a lack of neural input from the brain because it's cut off from the spinal cord. So to me, if the default without a nervous system is spastic contraction, then how the hell does all this kind of like concentric contraction work that all these people do in gyms? That's not where the sophistication lies, if you get me. Because you take the brain away and we do this and we're inert, and yeah. It's basically, it's like an inert structure, like a piece of wood. Well, then you add the brain in and it can relax. So to me, the sophistication of movement and muscle activity is actually in the eccentric control of lengthening. So I'm not sure how to answer your question. I think stretching does release that piezoelectric charge and change something, and I think everyone can feel that in experience. I'm not sure if concentric contraction is doing that so much as what eccentric contraction is. And part of the extension of our DNS model, the developmental stuff I just talked about before, is we used to have this barefoot movement class, and I'll mention my colleague's name because he's been very influential on my own understanding, as well as I just think he deserves way more attention. But Mark McGrath, Mark on Movement, his name is on Twitter, and I think he has a Facebook page on the same name. But we did a lot of exercises in terms of overspeed and deceleration and learning how to adequately lengthen under tension. And I can tell you that at the end of some of these sessions, and they're not metabolically taxing because we would never go into a new exercise unless we were fully recovered from the previous one. So there's nothing about being exhausted on the floor metabolically. But I remember this day so vividly. The last class before Christmas time, when we were all going to take a break, and we're all passing this card around to say thank you to Mark for having the class with the clinic with us and stuff. I could not write my name. So my nervous system was so kind of like overwhelmed with different information. I picked up this pen. I've written my name thousands of times since I could write my name. Thousands, as we all have. And I literally could not string the neural capacity together to write my name. To me, that told me some learning has taken place here in the nervous system. Something different has happened to the nervous system. I could go and do CrossFit or anything and swing bells around and climb ropes and be exhausted on the floor and get up and still write my name. I might be tired, but I could write my name. When we do this kind of exercise, this different kind of neural stimulation and neural input, it did something crazy to my nervous system. Like, it was just like, whoa. So, yeah. No, there's a whole realm of possibility.
Yeah, well, there's a whole neuroplasticity that's occurring around these kinds of movements. I mean, it's almost like it's more work for the brain than it is for the musculature and the fascia to do it,
Exactly. And when you contrast that with when we take the brain out, like in the injury, if all that happens is contraction and spastic paralysis, is that really where the intelligence of movement lies? I don't think so. It can't be. Because without this, we're just an inert structure that's contracted on the ground and we can't even move. But with it, we can lengthen under tension, you can take on new information, you can do incredible things. I mean, for anyone at home, go out to the nearest golf course or somewhere where there's a hill, a gradient, and run as fast as you can down the hill and just see how well you do. Anyone can run as fast as they can up a hill. Try running as fast as you can down the hill with good control and see how well you do. And then tell me what the sophistication is in movement. It's decelerating and it's control under extreme length and so forth. So to me, this is like where training needs to go, is to understand that the inputs equal the outputs, and you can train so much better for so many different things when you understand how movement is strung together at the brain level and how it's put together efficiently, And it's not about metabolic, how well you can, well, it is a little bit how well you can turn your food into energy and so forth, but if you can tighten up every part of your system to be that efficient, magic stuff happens.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Josh, thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me. It was a great chat. I'd like to do it again sometime.
Oh yeah, tell the listeners how they can learn more about you.
I have a webpage at paleoosteo.com. It's not very well updated, I must say, but there's some old blogs there and things that you might find interesting. You can also follow me on Facebook at Paleo Osteo, and I think the clinic Facebook page for the business side of things, which is less interactive. I think the name to search is Paleo Osteo Australia. And you could just look that name up for all the different kinds of social media. I think there's a Twitter. I never use the Twitter anymore, but you can look that stuff up. But yeah, follow on Facebook's probably where I kind of like keep the most output.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jonathan.